As you saw there, I did a cold start of the truck, and I want to talk about a couple videos that have gone up recently about how you should address a cold vehicle, and let me tell you what I think about it. Alright, so I'm back in the house in the warmth of my office as my truck's out there warming up. Yeah, it's warming up. So that's what the videos that were being posted recently is about, letting your vehicle warm up before you drive it. Now, both of these other videos by popular YouTubers, I'm sure you've seen them, say that you don't need to let a modern vehicle warm up. And that's true. If you just want your vehicle to start and run and drive, it's not like older vehicles that you had carburetors on, that you had to set the choke during fast idle. You had to let it warm up, and then you could kick your choke off and actually drive it. I've had plenty of cars like that. I'm old enough that the first few cars that I drove in my life and owned, they had carburetors on them. I had a carbureted car all the way up until the 90s, the early 90s, and many carbureted cars up until the early 90s. You got to remember that fuel injection was really becoming extremely popular in the mid to late 80s. And for me to buy something that was that new, it was kind of expensive for somebody that, might have been a little bit on the younger side, which I was at that point. So I don't think that the starting and running and driving part of it, that there's an argument there. I could hop in my truck, and as soon as my windshield is clear, if I scraped it off, I can start driving it. However, the one thing that nobody really addresses, and is a major deal and a major issue as far as I'm concerned, is what it does to the engine whenever it's cold. Now, first of all, regardless of what the oil is rated at, even if you have a zero oil, which on a winter weight oil, the first number is how fluid it is when it's cold. So the lower the number, the more like vegetable oil it is, the more like water it is, the thinner it is. And then that higher number is once the vehicle's at running temperature, the oil, of course, gets thicker. It's a fluid dynamic that's built into the oil that causes the molecules to bind in such a way that it becomes thicker. And that's for protection. You can run straight weight oil, but the problem with that is it's one number and it's thick when it's cold, and it may not be thick enough when it's hot. So modern oils has really helped things considerably, especially synthetics, and makes it to where you can drive more reasonably when it's cold. But the problem that you may not be aware of, and a lot of people don't address, is that a lot of the older engines, and some of the newer engines too, so don't take this just for the fact that my truck is older, it's a 97, and the technology in it is from the mid 80s. They never really changed much. It's still a concern on how that metal is reacting inside that engine. Now, engineers are going to design a car to run effectively when it's cold, obviously, and I'm talking about specifically pistons and rings and cylinders. So they know that when an engine is bone cold like it is right now, that it's not going to run as efficiently because it's not warm enough for the combustion process to be pure enough. So they usually run the mixture a little bit more rich than necessary until its cylinders get hot enough that it can burn a leaner amount of fuel, meaning less gas, a little bit more air. But when you first start it up, and as I sit here talk to you, I can still smell some of the carbon on me from the over-rich condition that it's running at. The fact that I'm in a state that doesn't really follow emission rules or laws here, I have no catalytic converters on my truck, nor an air pump on my truck. So whatever's being burned is coming through pretty raw, and I mean, you can smell it, and it's pretty rich at this point. But the reason that you've got to be concerned with what's happening as far as temperature-wise is that 99% of your driving of your vehicle happens at running temperature. So the engineers are going to build everything to be at their most efficient whenever you're at running temperature, not during startup, not during cold. So what I've always found, especially with these old Fords specifically, since I've had old Fords for a long time, and all this knowledge that I gained from running these older Fords was summed up with one perfect example, which I'll give you here shortly. But the Ford engines in these older vehicles, like a 97, I mean, you're going on 20 years now that this vehicle's been out. The pistons, like most other vehicles, are made to work and operate most effectively whenever at running temperature to where they have expanded at their greatest size. And the rings then seal at the greater size perfectly. So what that means is whenever you first start it up and the oil's pumping through the engine, although thick, it's still pumping through the engine. You've got reduced piston size, not by much, I mean I'm talking fractions here, that's trying to seal off that combustion process. So like in my case, if I pull out of my driveway, I am now immediately in a 55 mile per hour zone that's right out in front of my house. So you can guess what it's like for me to start my truck, drive up my very short driveway, and then pull out in traffic and my truck be expected to travel 55 miles an hour by other people that are driving up and down the road. You know how it is. People pull out in front of you and then they don't want to do the speed limit for the first quarter to half a mile, and then all of a sudden they decide they want to start driving the speed limit. Well, in my case, I don't want to be that person. So I definitely want to make sure that I can accelerate up to 55 relatively quickly. Well, I know whenever it's cold like it is today, I think it's about 22 degrees, 23 degrees, that it's going to make that cylinder that's smaller, and the piston that's even more small than the cylinder, allow oil to pass the rings, and you're going to have high oil consumption driving up the street until everything gets warm. So what I learned over the years is the best thing to do is let the truck run until the thermostat opens or comes very close to opening. I also noticed that whenever you get in a vehicle that the thermostat hasn't opened and it's cold out like today, and you try to accelerate and you go much above like 3,200, 3,500 RPMs in a big block engine for sure, I would have to say that number's probably around 3,000. But in a small block like a 302 engine, the 5-liter Mustang engine, the old 5-liter, I'm talking about the old Windsor blocks, that engine probably about 3,500 RPMs, 3,600 RPMs. You want to stay below that until the thermostat opens, again, on a cold day like today. And now let me give you the example of why. I used to work at Summit Racing, and although we had a couple different buildings, most of you that are familiar with Summit Racing, the new building that the company's been at for quite some time now, since the early 90s, even the old building, which was down the street, and it was an old Davy Tree building off of Gilchrist Road, those are right off of I-76, one of the major interstates that runs through Ohio. And of course, the interstate back in the 90s, you know, the speed limit was only 55, but still, most everyone drove 60, 65 miles an hour. Whenever I would go to work in the morning, I would start my car, and again, because you can see the road out here, I would leave and I would accelerate kind of hard when the vehicle was still cold, maybe around 3,000 RPMs, and drive 35 miles to get to work. Once at work all day there, I would come back out to the car, I would fire it up, and then I would drive just a short distance to get on the expressway, which again, right immediately on that on-ramp, I would be accelerating up to 55, 60 miles an hour. Again, not getting into it extremely hard, but still getting into it. Even though I kept it around 3,500, 4,000 RPMs accelerating, and I didn't run it to 5,500 RPMs or 6,000 RPMs, I noticed that I was using oil, even though the engine only had 47,000 miles. Now, this was back in 1992, and I had bought a 1989 5-liter sedan. So the engine was exactly the way it's supposed to be from the factory, and it hardly had any miles on it. The other thing that I noticed is if I did the worst thing possible, and that was start up the vehicle cold like today, and accelerate up the street at a high rate. And I'm talking about pulling out, putting it to the wood, running it up to 6 grand through the first gear for sure, and then partially through the second gear, and then doing the same on the way home from work. Within a week's time, I would go through a quart of oil. Now, I'm giving you an example of the 5-liter Mustangs because those Mustangs had forged pistons, and those pistons definitely need to expand to be at their best potential to do the sealing that they need to give you the correct coefficient of combustion and the metal coefficiency as far as it being at its peak. Well, the problem with forged pistons is whenever it's cold, you get oil consumption, just like I mentioned. Well, that's still the same, that holds true to aluminum pistons that are not forged. You still have cast, and they still need to expand. So the fact that I let my vehicles run to warm up isn't for driving conditions, just to let the car go up and down the road. It's so it can warm up and put the piston at the correct size so I'm not burning through oil. Now, as far as the other wear, and people say, oh, your vehicle wears the most whenever it's at idle. You've seen those commercials from going all the way back to the late 70s, early 80s, and they talked about how torturous city driving was and light-to-light driving and letting a car sit in an idle, a gas engine. And it's true. There's a lot of wear and there's a lot of torture that does happen because everything's operating at its minimum. The engine's at its minimum speed, which is great because it's not generating a lot of heat, but it's also not generating a lot of cooling power either. So you don't have a lot of airflow, and you have very low idle, and you're having everything under some sort of a load, especially when you're crawling through traffic, like bumper-to-bumper traffic, like you see in LA. So as far as letting your vehicle warm up, that's one thing you're not going to get an argument from on any qualified mechanic that knows anything about cylinder pressures and how things operate, which every mechanic does. And that is, you have to let your pistons get to the size that they need to be so you don't have blow-by. That's just the way things work. It's not anything that's a secret, but a lot of these guys are saying you don't have to let your vehicle warm up because the new technology with fuel injection allows you to drive it. And it's true, you can drive it all you want, but you're going to consume oil. And that's still even on the newer vehicles today. No engineer is designing an engine that runs at peak efficiency whenever the block is at 40 degrees or 50 degrees or 70 degrees. They're wanting that block to be at full running temperature, and that's where everything is engineered to run at its peak and its best. So why not just give it a few extra minutes and let your vehicle get to that peak temperature so you're not wearing components prematurely. Now, as far as the oil, everything hasn't expanded the way that it should, and that oil, although it's at a lower rating whenever it's cold, it still doesn't flow quite the way that you might think it should. And again, going back to those 5-liter Mustangs, those came with lifters with roller bearings on them. And if you got thick oil in there, even though it was a 10W30 oil, which it called for, those little tiny needles that are inside those roller bearings may not get the kind of lubrication that they necessarily need. So it's always a good idea to let your vehicle do a little bit of warming up before you drive it above 3,000 RPMs. Now, if you live in a development or allotment or city driving, to where you're light to light to light, and you're not going to get above 30 miles an hour until the thermostat opens on the car, then go right ahead. Start your car up, make sure everything's cleared off and you're comfortable, and start driving it, because you're going to warm it up faster by driving it that short little distance. But by no means get on a road that you're going to be doing, I would have to say, almost over 45 miles an hour. You want to stay below 3,000 RPMs to 3,500 RPMs until your thermostat opens. That's really the best thing to do. The other thing you should be aware of is, for example, my wife's little Honda. Because that car is so much smaller and that engine is so much smaller, the cooling system is smaller, so there's less coolant that's running through it. This car gets warmed up right away. It's amazing how fast you'll start having heat being produced inside that car. Yet you can see my truck I'm sure it's still, all this time during this video, has not warmed up. The temperature hasn't even opened the thermostat yet. It's close, but not quite. Now I have a 180 degree thermostat in here right now, which I probably change for the winter if the heat doesn't feel warm enough for me, and if our winter gets kind of cold, I'll put it back up to about 192, 195, which came factory in this truck. But right now I've got 180 in there, and this entire long video that we've been doing, it's still not warm. So we're gonna go ahead and let this thing go a little bit longer, and then I'll shut it off because it's been sitting here a few days. So that's what I wanted to talk about, guys. I'm glad you checked out my video. If you like this video, click like or subscribe, and remember, it's your vehicle. Run it the way you think it should be run, not what somebody else says. Talk to you guys later. Bye.